In this lesson, we'll learn about some of the basic tools inside Illustrator that we can use to create or draw our vector objects. All right, so now that we know sort of the ins and the outs of vector objects and how they work, let's look at some ways that we can create vector objects. Well, we're going to spend actually this lesson and the next lesson learning about this, but we're going to run through a number of tools here inside of Illustrator in this lesson, and in the next lesson we'll spend that entire lesson focusing on what I would consider the most important tools. So let's go ahead and first talk about the shape tools. We're going to want to go ahead and look over here in the tool panel. And kind of right in this area right here is where most of the tools for creating vector objects are stored. So I'm going to click on this square right here and hold down. And you'll see that this is actually called the rectangle tool. Now, there's a lot of tools underneath this that I would encourage you to play with in this lesson, with the exception of really this flare tool. That's a little different, but let's go ahead and pick on the rectangle tool. Now, all these tools nested underneath this are going to work in a very similar fashion. We can draw a rectangle using the rectangle tool simply by clicking and dragging it onto our artboard here. And you can see if I hold down Control to access my selection tool and click away, I've drawn a rectangle that has the default attributes applied to it. Again, white fill with a black stroke. Now, if I come over here and hold down the Shift key, I can actually constrain that rectangle so it's now a square. So again, I'm drawing it from kind of the point that I click on the artboard. Now, we could come in here and we could mix in the Alt key into this mix if we wanted to draw the shape from the center. So I'm holding down Alt and Shift right now to draw a square from the center here. Now, as we click and drag these out, play some with combining the keyboard shortcuts Alt and Shift into the mix. And once you're comfortable doing that, let's say we wanted to draw a perfect square from the center. We'll draw one right over here. Now we decide we needed to change the position of this object. We wanted to actually put it on the other side of our artboard. While dragging out like this, we can actually hold down the space bar and basically reposition this object somewhere else and then release the space bar and continue to draw it. Now that's something that I use quite a bit when I'm working here inside of Illustrator. Also remembering that while you're drawing these basic primitive shapes, you can hold down the Control key and it's going to access the last selection tool you had active, whether it's the selection tool or the direct selection tool. So holding down the Control key, I can come over and I can reposition these objects that I've just drawn in whatever orientation that I want, and then just simply release the Control key and I can continue drawing my rectangles. Now, each one of these shapes underneath it are going to work very similar to the rectangle tool. We can click them and drag them out on the canvas, or the artboard rather, just like I've been doing so far. We can also just click once onto the artboard and we're going to access the settings for that particular tool. So let's say we wanted exactly a 50 pixel by 50 pixel square. So we could put those values in. We could also come in here and link those two values together using this button. I'll go ahead and just hit OK. And Illustrator will create a shape for us, exactly the dimensions we need. Now, each one of these tools, like I said, are going to work very similar. Say the rounded rectangle tool. Again, we could come in and draw those shapes out on our artboard here, just like so. Or we could click on the artboard and access the settings for that tool. This time we have height, width, and corner radius. So these are the shape tools inside of Illustrator. These are tools that are really good for creating primitive shapes. Now again, keep in mind primitive shapes are just that. We could always come in here and start to modify these, maybe using our direct selection tool to move those anchor points around some. If we wanted maybe a more complex shape, we could come in here and use our Convert Anchor Point tool, hitting Shift-C to start pulling out the control handles for those. If we wanted to create maybe some arcs and some things like that in the shapes. So really we can take these primitive shapes or primitive objects and we can start building and converting them into more complex objects. So let's go ahead and just take these all and delete those here. These are, again, the shape tools. So all of them nested right underneath that rectangle tool here. The next tool I want to talk to you about is right below that. It's actually called the pencil tool. Now, Illustrator is one of these applications that works really, really well if you combine it with a pressure-sensitive tablet. So right now I'm working on a Wacom Cintiq, and this is an application that can take advantage of a lot of the pressure-sensitive features of your tablet. We'll talk more about that here in just a moment, but the pencil tool is really just as it sounds. It's going to draw a path that's sort of a free-form path. So you can see here, if I control-click away, we've drawn a path exactly like I've drawn it onto my Cintiq. Now if we come in and grab our direct selection tool, we can come in and start to see all of the anchor points that have been placed along that path to create that freeform path. Now when you're working with the pencil tool, you'll see here that that's actually an open path. If you want to create a closed path, let's just come over here and draw another shape. When I get back close to the beginning, I'm going to hold down the Alt key, and you'll notice here that a little closed circle appears next to my pencil tool. If I release my mouse button, or in this case my stylus from my Cintiq, it's going to go ahead and complete that path. And you'll see that basically Illustrator takes the shortest route to close that path off, just like so. Now this path also has some kind of shakiness to it. If I wanted to maybe smooth that out, the pencil tool actually ties in with a tool called the smooth tool. It's actually right underneath the pencil tool here, but with the pencil tool active, a selected path can be smoothed easily by holding down the Alt key. So notice my cursor changes just a little bit. It looks like a pencil with a little spiral line around it. I can now start to drag this smooth tool over my path and start to maybe smooth out some of those jagged edges that path had. You can see here that the path is adjusting ever so slightly to sort of smooth out. And you can see here, if you look really close, the anchor points are shifting position. More of them are being added, all in an effort to smooth this path out. All right, so again, this is the pencil tool. Let's go ahead and move on to a very similar tool to the pencil tool. It's actually right next to it over in the brush, or rather the tool panel. It's called the brush tool. We'll go ahead and grab that here. Now the keyboard shortcut for the pencil tool is N on your keyboard. The keyboard tool, or the keyboard shortcut for the brush tool, on the other hand, is B for brush. So with the brush tool active, let's go ahead and jump over to our panel dock on the right here, and I'm going to grab this one that looks like a little cup with some brushes in it. So this is the brushes panel, and there are a number of brush strokes inside this panel, or available to us, and I'll show you where in just a moment, that can be applied to a path as we're creating it here with the brush tool. So if I come in here and paint in a simple stroke, you can see it has all the anchor points that a stroke with the pencil tool would have had. But if I click away from that by control clicking and zoom in really closely, you'll notice that this kind of looks like something that maybe a pencil or even a brush would have, as it drags through paint, would create. So you can see here that there is actually a brush stroke selected over here, and that's the stroke that's being applied to my path. So it's kind of a decorative stroke. Again, I've drawn a couple of open paths here. We can actually draw a closed path with the brush tool the exact same way we would with the pencil tool, just simply by holding down the Alt key. And Illustrator will go ahead and close that path off, creating that closed shape. So now, like I've mentioned before, there are a number of different strokes that are available to us that we can apply using the brush tool right here inside the brushes panel. And they're stored in what is known as a brush library. You can click on this button in the lower left-hand corner of the brush panel, and you'll see a number of different libraries that are available to us. Let's go ahead and say we want to go ahead and look at let's look at the borders, and we'll come up and open maybe this novelty borders library. You'll see another panel opens up here. We'll just go ahead and stretch that down, and I can come in here, and with this path selected, we can come in and maybe apply one of these decorative borders to it as well. So you can see there are a number of different types of strokes available to us through the brush panel. feel free to play with those. The brush tool and the pencil tool are very similar in the way they feel, and really in the end result they give being simply a free-form path. So with that said, let's go ahead and close out of these, and I want to show you one last tool before we wrap this lesson up. Let me just go ahead and delete this information here. Now, this last tool is a little bit different, but it's one of my favorites in creating vector artwork, and it's called the blob brush. It's right over here below the brush tool, and if I click that, you'll see here that we get another little brush icon next to our cursor, and we have like a little circle underneath it, and we can come in here and we can paint with our blob brush. Now, the way the blob brush differs from the regular brush tool here inside of Illustrator is that it creates a filled shape, not a stroke. So rather a path with a stroke applied. So if we look kind of at the end result of that, let me just paint a little bit more. You can see here that what we've got is a filled shape that has a black fill attribute applied to it here. And because it's selected, I can continue to come in here and I can add to that shape just by painting more with this. Now, if you've worked in Photoshop before, then you're probably familiar with some of the keyboard shortcuts for using the brush tool in Photoshop. There's a couple of keyboard shortcuts that are the same here in Illustrator with the blob brush. The bracket keys above the enter key on your keyboard are actually going to increase and decrease the size of the blob brush. So if we wanted to come in and fill in this area right here, we could just simply by enlarging our brush tip. So you can see here that the blob brush is a really great way to be able to utilize a tablet to create big areas of filled vector shapes. So in this lesson, we've gone over kind of a quick overview of a lot of the different tools that we can use to create vector shapes. But in my opinion, we haven't talked about the most important tool yet. So let's go ahead at this point and move on to the next lesson, and we'll learn about Illustrator's pen tool.